Hello everyone, I'm Adam Foster, I'm a PhD student at Oxford, and I wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to the organisers for inviting me to this mini-symposium on model-based optimal experimental design at SIAM CSE 21. I actually think it's a terrific idea to bring together researchers working on experimental design, because I know we can sometimes be at different corners of academia, so it's nice for us all to be together at this mini-symposium. And I'll try and give maybe the perspective from machine learning, as that's my academic background. So today I'm talking about a unified stochastic gradient approach to designing Bayesian-optimal experiments, and I'll get started by looking at the kind of questions that we're trying to answer with experimental design. So suppose we're designing a psychology study to work out how much people value money today compared to money in the future when they have to wait to receive it. To study that, we could ask a question of the form, would you prefer $90 today or $100 in a year? But obviously there are a lot of slightly different designs that we could choose for that question. So I've put another sort of candidate design here. And what we really have is a continuous design space of possible questions parameterized by this design parameter, which I denote by Xi. And what we're looking for is the optimal design, the one that is going to be most informative, most useful, and help us study the underlying phenomenon most efficiently. So to say what we really mean by that, informative, efficient, etc., we're going to bring in some statistical framework, and I'm going to start with a Bayesian model for the experiment. So in this Bayesian model, we have this latent variable theta, and that's our target of inference. It's the thing we're trying to find out about. It's some sort of model latent, and it's unknown to us at the start. And then we have the design, which isn't a random variable, that's just a parameter directly under our control. And then together these produce the outcome, and that would be the answer to the question, the observation of our scientific process. And from the outcome, we're going to work back and do inference on theta. So to measure the quality of an experiment, we adopt information gain. This is a common measure. It goes back to Lindley's seminal paper, 1956, and it's the reduction in entropy from the prior to the posterior. And since entropy is a measure of uncertainty, if the information gain is large, it means we've become much more certain about the value of this unknown latent variable theta. But to turn this into a criterion for selecting between designs, we have to take an expectation over the unseen observation using its Bayesian marginal distribution. And this gives us a criterion that depends only on the design, and that's expected information gain, which is also a mutual information. And this has a number of attractive properties as established by Lindley and subsequent authors. So it's very attractive mathematically, but unfortunately it's computationally very difficult to work with. And that's because it involves this posterior density, p of theta conditional on y and xi, and that's often going to be intractable in your sort of larger scale model. And then it's worse because it's inside of this expectation over the observation. So we have to recompute posteriors for multiple potential data sets. And so we've coined the phrase, it comes from my supervisor Tom Rainforth, doubly intractable for this and a range of related computational problems. So in our paper, Variational Bayesian-Optimal Experimental Design, which was joint work by me and a number of other people, we asked a question, could we use ideas from amortized variational inference in machine learning to efficiently estimate I of Xi? And I just want to pick out one idea from that paper. We looked at a number of estimators, and I want to pick out this BA lower bound. So this is a lower bound that had been seen in information theory, and we showed that it could also apply to experimental design. And it says that for any Q phi, so Q phi is an inference network, it approximates the posterior, and we can think of it as a neural network with parameters phi that takes y as its input, and it maps to a variational distribution over theta. So if theta was discrete, it would simply map to a vector of probabilities. And if it was continuous, we could say use a Gaussian variational family, mapping to the mean and variance. So for any q phi of that form that I just described, we have this variational lower bound in that the EIG is larger than this expectation. And that allows us to train phi by maximizing this bound using stochastic gradient, and it just really looks like maximum likelihood learning to train phi by maximization. And we can see that we're going to get the best estimate of EIG when the bound is at its maximum, and at that point we use a large number of samples on the right hand side to evaluate our point estimate of EIG. But that's only a small part of the problem, and I now want to sort of motivate the main paper I'm talking about, this unified stochastic gradient paper, because whilst estimating xi at a single point is a step forward, what we're really looking to do is to optimize the EIG over the entire design space. And I'm now going to assume that xi lives in a continuous space, so Rn or a subset of Rn. And what we want to do is find the optimal design across that entire design space. And a common way that is used to search across continuous design spaces is a two-stage procedure. So to search over designs, we have this outer optimizer, something like Bayesian optimization, and that chooses candidate designs to try. And then we feed that to whatever process we're using to do EIG estimation. So it could be that variational bound that I talked about, it could be something completely different, but that's used to make point estimates of xi, and then those point estimates get fed back into the Bayes-opt algorithm, and then that chooses the next candidate design. So we have this kind of iterative two-stage procedure. But we don't really like that two-stage procedure, and it's inefficient for a number of reasons. It doesn't share computation between designs, even very nearby designs, and it expends resources exploring unpromising regions of design space, and Bayes-opt in particular scales poorly with design dimension, and I think that would apply to pretty much any two-stage procedure. So if we try and get up to, say, a 100-dimensional design, and we'll later see an experiment with a 100-dimensional design, Bayes-opt is not really an option there. So that was the starting point for this paper, a unified stochastic gradient approach to designing Bayesian-optimal experiments. And again, this is joint work between myself and a number of other people. And the question we were trying to answer there is, can we search over the design space more efficiently, perhaps by using these variational lower bounds that I talked about in the previous section? And the key idea of this stochastic gradient paper was to try and define a one-stage procedure. So to get away from that two-stage idea and try and simultaneously estimate and optimize this expected information gain. And the idea would be that we wouldn't waste resources on unpromising regions, and we could share computation between nearby designs, and we could obtain something that scales to much larger design spaces. And that could be useful, for example, in batch design, where you want to simultaneously design this sort of high-dimensional batch. And the core of our idea then is to use variational lower bounds. So if we start with this inequality in the top left, our variational lower bounds are functions of both the design and a variational parameter phi, and they're always a lower bound for every value of phi. So if we were to fix design and then optimize with respect to phi, and that's the approach that we took in that variational BOED paper, then we could obtain a good point estimate of EIG at design xi. But then the idea in this stochastic gradient paper is, why not optimize with respect to the design and the variational parameter simultaneously? So instead of solving a single optimization problem in phi, but then repeating that for different designs, we could solve one optimization problem on this extended set of variables, both design and variational parameter. And that's exactly what we propose to do in our unified approach. So we're going to optimize design xi and variational parameter phi simultaneously using stochastic gradient. And this works well because whilst there is no unbiased gradient estimator for EIG, or if there is, it's rather involved to calculate it using MLMC. This is a very recent paper on that topic. For the variational lower bounds, there's no complexity. We can compute unbiased gradient estimators cheaply using our favorite AutoGrad framework or whatever. So when we take a single gradient step in this unified approach, we update phi, the variational parameter. And as you'll remember, we have a lower bound for every value of phi. So as we change phi to maximize the bound, we're going to get a better estimate of the objective function. But simultaneously with that, we're going to update the design. So we've improved phi to improve our quality of the estimate of the EIG in the current neighborhood of the current design. Then we're going to take a gradient step with respect to the design xi, and that is going to lead to an improved design relative to our current approximation of the objective function. And that's a single gradient step of our unified procedure. Update phi and xi using gradients on the lower bound. And then we're going to run that for obviously a large number of steps, hopefully towards the convergence of that stochastic gradient problem. And then the final design should be close to the optimal design for this entire problem. So we've got away from doing any two-stage procedure. We just run this big stochastic gradient problem, and then we see what the final value of xi was. So I've sort of left open the question, which lower bound should we actually use? So here I've written down the true EIG. This is a way of writing it down. And we can see the integrand here involves the likelihood, which we're going to assume is known for our models of interest. It's a known quantity. Although in the paper we discuss a bound that doesn't require a known likelihood. But if we assume it to be known, then the missing piece is the marginal likelihood py given xi. And here's an estimator that one could consider for that. And you'll see it looks somewhat like an importance sampling estimate. So we have theta 1 up to theta l chosen from a proposal distribution q phi. That's quite standard, but then the unusual thing is to reuse the original sample theta 0, and you'll see that that is effectively a sample of the true posterior. So that's going to give a biased estimate of marginal likelihood. But if I stick this biased estimator into the denominator, what I get is this adaptive contrastive estimation lower bound. So that's a new lower bound on mutual information. And you can see from its form, I have just substituted that equation from the last slide in place of the marginal likelihood. And we call this contrastive estimation to emphasize the connection to contrastive learning and noise contrastive estimation in machine learning. And we can see this sample theta 0, that's the original or true sample, and these other samples are kind of our contrastive samples. So that's the main lower bound that we focus on, and then we can actually pick out some special cases. So if we use the prior as our proposal, then we have prior contrastive estimation, and that can be effective, especially for a simpler problem. And if we set capital L equals 0, we actually get back to that BA lower bound that we talked about in the previous paper. But now it is being used in a unified stochastic gradient procedure. So now it's being used sort of optimizing over both design and variational parameter. And here are some experimental results. So on the simple death process, we see that we're able to find high EIG designs quite efficiently. This is in about 2 minutes. And Bayesian optimization can't find the best optimum. And if we look at scaling with design dimension, here we have a Bayesian optimization that can use the true EIG, so it's kind of given a bit of a head start, but it still breaks down with design dimension, whereas these gradient methods are very consistent and very close to the true design, especially the BA and ACE methods for that problem. And then finally we looked at 100-dimensional design from pharmacology, and we compared with expert designs, and we found that these gradient methods, they can do better than the expert, and the best came from the most general bound, the ACE bound. And I just want to give you a few words on my current work, our current work in our group, how could we extend these ideas to sequential experiments? So not just designing one experiment, but a whole sequence. And this is something we've just released onto the arXiv, Deep Adaptive Design. And the idea is to build a neural network which takes as input the design and observation pairs from the previous steps of a sequential experiment, and then it processes them using this sort of neural network architecture to give the next design. And then we can actually train the neural network itself using variational lower bounds, which we can sort of extend from the one-step case to the sequential case. So that's just hit arXiv, and I'd encourage you to go and check that out for more details. So that only leaves me to say thank you very much for listening, and thank you to my collaborators Martin, Eli, Paul, Yee Whye, Tom, Noah, Matt, Desi and Ilyas. And these are the arXiv IDs of the papers that I talked about today. And yeah, thank you once again for inviting me to the Minisymposium.